This happened 11 years ago when I was 16. To this day, it sends chills down my spine. I've been camping in some questionable places. I've got many unexplainable stories. However, this one is by far the one that has stuck with me the most. My stepfather Rob and I, during high school holidays in Queensland, would go camping. It was a sort of guy's trip away. Rob has since passed away, but he was always keen to get me into the outdoors, teach me some survival skills and bush knowledge, which I still use to this day. That year's trip, Rob and I were heading way off the beaten track to a place called Kings Junction, a good 9-hour drive from any civilization or phone reception. It was really nothing out of the ordinary from our usual trips, but it was a longer trip than usual. After a long and rather boring drive, from a 16-year-old's perspective, we finally made it to the site, where we would set up for the next 6 nights that we were supposed to stay there. Rob and I didn't take long to set up the tents and camp kitchen, so we grabbed our rifles and went for a quick hunt, looking for wild pigs before it got too dark, and before I started to complain about being hungry. As the sun began to set, we headed back to the campsite. We were a bit confused, though, when we got back, finding our tents had both been pushed over. It looked like someone had driven through our campsite, running them over. Rob turned to me and said, "Well, looks like we're sleeping under the stars tonight, bud." He always used to try to make light out of the dim situation. I tried to laugh it off with him, but something about this didn't sit right. We'd been camping hundreds of times in places a lot less isolated than this, and nothing, besides the odd stolen shovel, had happened. I pushed the anxiety to the side, carrying on setting our sleeping bags up under some shelter. As nightfall came and our dinner was finished, Rob said goodnight, and he rolled into his sleeping bag. I, however, being 16, not having a healthy sleeping pattern at the time, chose to stay up a little longer, continuing to listen to Rob's slim, dusty records he would bring on our trips. At one point, I checked the time on my watch. It had been 2 hours since Rob went to sleep. He was snoring at his usual level, that of a Mack truck. But I suddenly got the feeling then something wasn't quite right. I felt as if someone was watching us. There was a tree line and a creek about 50 meters away from where we were camping. I grabbed my camp chair and I positioned it so that I had a clear sight of the tree line, specifically the direction from which I felt that ice-cold feeling of eyes watching me. Shortly after repositioning my chair, I began to see movement around the darkness of the base of the trees. I rubbed my eyes and tried to convince myself I was just exhausted from the road trip, just seeing stuff that wasn't there. I turned to grab a soft drink from the esky. As I reached for a can, I heard a voice. Chris, come here." It sounded faint but far away. It sounded like Rob calling me. I slowly raised my eyes, looking up to see Rob, dead asleep and still snoring, less than a meter away from me. I froze. How could he have called for me? It didn't make any sense. I quickly grabbed my long-range head torch, shining it through the tree line from where I saw those shadows moving. What I saw next will forever be burned into my brain. This figure, it looked like a person who had not eaten for months. It had long, skinny limbs and stood probably about 6 feet tall, with basically just a rib cage for a torso. Its face, I can only describe it as something out of a horror film. It had no lips. It had pure white eyes. It had white foaming drool running down its mouth. I screamed and began to shake Rob awake. "Rob, grab the gun!" I shouted at him. He jumped out of that sleeping bag and grabbed my arm. "What is it? What's wrong?" he asked. There's something in the trees. I saw it. We have to go. Rob, trying to calm me down, said, "Mate, it's probably just a possum in the tree or something." "I'm telling you, I know what I saw. We have to go," I pleaded. Rob finally gave in and grabbed his rifle and torch. "If I come back and there's nothing there, you're cooking us breakfast," he said, trying to make light of the situation again. As I sat there holding a hammer, thinking that would help me, 10 minutes went by, and I began to really panic. Rob should be back by now, I thought to myself. Shortly after, I heard footsteps quickly approaching. My heart raced as I gripped that hammer tighter. "Hurry up, bud. Pack everything. We're leaving," Rob said, running back into the campsite. "What happened? Did you see anything?" I asked. "This just isn't a safe place to stay. We need to go, now," Rob said, trying not to scare me more than I already was. Rob threw everything we'd unpacked back into the tray of the ute and asked me to stay in the passenger seat until he had everything packed up, which didn't ease my fear in the slightest. As Rob finally jumped into the driver's seat and started the truck, which was an old Land Rover Defender, which barely started at the best of times, the engine turned twice and didn't fire. As he went to turn the key a third time, he froze. I saw him look in the direction of the tree line and his face go pale. As my eyes followed his line of sight, there it was, staring at us from the shrubs. Without taking my eyes off the creature, I whispered to Rob, "Rob, please just start the truck." He turned the key, and as the engine fired, the creature took a step towards us. Rob put the truck into first gear. The creature took another step. As Rob took off, flooring it out of the campsite, the creature followed. I turned around to see the creature standing right where I'd been sitting in my camp chair, hunched over, still looking at us as we left through the dust. That night will forever be something I'll have etched into my memory. It's safe to say I've never had any intentions of returning to King's Junction, and camping trips always stay within distance of cell reception. I hope to tell you guys some more of my camp stories, because the Australian outback is a beautiful yet mysterious place. Sometimes the unknown is terrifying. Now, the following is a true story told to me by my stepfather, who says this experience changed his perspective of the dark. I'll tell it from his point of view. I was out on an overnight camping trip by myself. Wasn't anything unusual. I used to do this quite often on my weekends off work from the lumberyard. I threw a small pack I'd made for camping in the back of my truck, which contained some food and medical supplies, and drove off. It was a particularly hot and humid night during a Queensland summer, so I decided not to take my tent. I would sleep under the stars in my camp stretcher instead. As the sun began to set that night, I got a small campfire lit, and I cooked my dinner, boiling a kettle for my usual late-night tea. As I finished my meal and filled the metal kettle with water, I began to hear a sound, like footsteps, coming from all around me. These footsteps were moving quite fast. Initially, I thought it was more than one person walking around me. As I looked around, trying to determine what the sound was and where it was coming from, I saw what looked to be the shadow of a dog darting in and out of the trees around my campsite. I grabbed my torch, which was an old one, and didn't give off much light, but it was enough to investigate this shadow I'd seen. As I shone my torch around where I first saw the shadow, a black dog stood there. It was looking at me. Of course, at first, I just thought it was a dog. I didn't feel scared or intimidated, just curious. But then, I watched this dog stand up and what I saw it experienced next would shock me to my core. The dog was standing on its hind legs, which resembled those of a goat's legs, leading down to what appeared to be a pair of hooves. Its jaw was almost human-like, and its paws were more like long claws. I grabbed a log that had been in the fire and swung madly at the creature, a display of intimidation to try to scare it off. This didn't bother it at first, but once I took a step towards it and swung again, the creature snarled. It was unlike a dog at all. It was unlike any animal I'd ever heard. I gripped that log tighter, and I threw it at the creature, but it just stood there, staring at me still. However, when I truly thought that this was how my life was going to come to an end, it slowly, still keeping eye contact, dropped back down to all fours and backed up into the tree line, slowly disappearing into the shadows. In a rush of fear, I scurried to pack what little I had with me, throwing it into the back of my truck and taking off. Now, this experience did not completely scare me into never camping again, but it did make me much more cautious. I try not to think about the possible other outcomes of that encounter. I don't know if it was just dumb luck or if the creature was only curious. Maybe he just wanted me to know that was his home, not mine. But I will never disrespect or disregard the places I camp at for the rest of my life, because you never know what's watching from the shadows. The following is a different story. Another yearly camping trip with my family had come around. It was school holidays in North Queensland, and my family and I packed the family car, driving what felt like days to me, but was probably just an 8-hour drive in real time. We arrived at our campsite, and as usual, my parents made sure there was no cell reception, so that my sister and I wouldn't spend the whole holiday texting friends. As night fell quickly, we set up our tents and sleeping bags before gathering around the fire, trying to conjure up some small talk with our parents. Once the folks went to bed, my younger sister and I stayed up, playing a few games of Uno before the feeling of boredom quickly took hold. I decided I wanted to go down to the creek for a midnight fish. Anything to cure the mind-numbing boredom of not being in front of a screen of some sort. I picked up my fishing rod and tackle box. I even grabbed a head torch, and I began to walk out of the campsite. My sister, who's always been the smarter of the two of us, decided to stay put in the safety of the lit camp area. As I got farther and farther away from the camp, a strange feeling began to rise from the pit of my stomach. However, it wasn't terribly strong, not enough to turn me around and abort the mission I was on. I soon arrived at the creek. It was a maybe 150-meter walk in all. I could still see the flickering light from the campfire in the distance. I grabbed my rod and flung the baited hook into the water, waiting for a bite. As I sat there, peacefully but cautiously, awaiting some sort of excitement from the water, I began hearing what sounded like cracking noises, not far from where I'd positioned myself. The feeling of anticipation quickly turned into fear. I scanned my surroundings, expecting to see my sister walking through the shrubs, but she wouldn't have come this far, not without a light. Even so, I called out, "Sis, is that you?" At this point, I started looking around more frantically. The cracking sound was now followed by what sounded like a woman crying. I frantically felt for my head torch's light switch, and I turned it back on, now scouring the area around me with light. The sight I was met with turned my blood cold. In the thickest part of the bushes, I saw what appeared to be a woman. This woman, however, well, she was hovering off the ground. I couldn't even see her legs or feet, just a torso. Her shirt or dress looked shredded. The woman's face was haunting. She had long black hair flowing down the front of her face, a face where I could see no eyes, and there was what appeared to be blood all over her arms. I dropped my fishing rod. The woman then turned to me. I'd never run so fast in my life. I bolted all the way back to camp, the back of my neck turning freezing cold as I did. "Whoa, what's wrong? Where's your fishing staff?" my sister asked. It broke. Why were you running so fast? You look like you've seen a ghost." I think I was just seeing things. I got spooked." "You're such a wuss," she teased me. I didn't sleep much that night, nor any other night we stayed there, and I sure as heck didn't leave the campsite after sundown. On the drive back, I asked my parents. "There wouldn't happen to be a woman or anyone that lives around that area we were camping, right?" "No, honey, there's no one around for hours out there," my mom answered. My stepdad added, "I've heard that a woman died in that creek, drowned years ago." My mom slapped my stepfather on the arm. My whole body went cold. That to me was confirmation that I wasn't just seeing things that night. To this day, I have more questions than answers, but I try to force myself not to think about it.
Growing up, my mom had always taught me it's okay to believe that something else might be out there. Like ghosts, demons, aliens. To us, they're all possibilities. From a young age, she told me tons of her true personal experiences with the supernatural and real-life awful people. There's one story that still gets to me, because it involves both. My mom was born in the UK, but between the ages of 7 and 14, she was raised in Australia. At age 7 or 8, her dad took my mom and her 2 brothers, my uncles, for a holiday in a cabin owned by one of her dad's friends in the middle of the outback. You need to know how truly isolated this place was. There was no one around for miles and miles. There was a lake on the property, and sparingly few trees, with a bridge that curved over the water. They'd booked to stay there for a couple of weeks. By the end of this story, you'll see why they didn't make it past 10 days. The first few days of the holiday went by. Nothing crazy out of the ordinary happened. But my mom could tell there was something definitely off about the man that owned the cabin. I'll just refer to him as the owner. The owner apparently tended to hang around the kids, my mom and her brothers. He was constantly asking them questions. Questions that seemed to get more and more personal and inappropriate as time went on. Though it made my mother uncomfortable, she was raised to be polite. So usually she answered these questions with a smile. After all, she was only 7 or 8, so she barely knew any better. Bear in mind, this was whilst her dad was not around. He was usually around the property somewhere. Now, he was a good dad. He wouldn't leave his kids unattended. And the owner was his friend, someone he thought he could trust. So he didn't mind leaving the kids with him, as they knew each other well. It's worth mentioning that this story was from the 60s. Parenting was much different back then. As the days wore on, the owner started to get a bit too close for comfort in my mom's eyes. While he liked her brothers just as well, he seemed to take a particular liking to my mother. Again, she was almost 8 years old, and he was a fully grown man. His comments towards her turned more and more creepy. Naturally, my mom started to fear the owner. She wanted to say something to her father about it, but she worried he would just think she was being silly. One fateful night, her fears became reality. When her dad was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, and her brothers were already tucked in, the owner took my mom aside in the dimly lit hallway, grasping her arm. He said the following to her: "Meet me on the lake bridge at midnight tonight. If you tell anyone where you're going, especially your daddy, your brothers won't make it to see the sunrise." Mom told me that was the first time she had ever been frozen from fear. Not knowing what to do or say, she simply nodded, tears in her eyes. She ran off to her bedroom that she shared with her brothers. Midnight drew closer and closer. Mom hadn't been able to get a wink of sleep. The moonlight was the only source of light shining in through the windows in front of the beds. She didn't tell me much about how the room looked, only that there was this big clock hanging on the wall, ticking and talking, and she couldn't stop staring at it. She was so scared, thinking of all the possible outcomes. What would happen if she didn't go? Or, the scarier, what would happen if she did? It was then that Mom's eyes transfixed on something she'd only ever read about in stories. A shadowy figure stood directly at the end of the bed. For a brief, fleeting moment, she thought it was the owner, but realized quickly that it couldn't have been, because she could see the window behind it through the figure. Mum said it was unclear to tell whether this shadow figure resembled a man or a woman, just that it was simply there, and she was very frightened. It was a few minutes dangerously close to midnight, and the shadowy figure started to come closer to the bed. Mum brought her duvet up to just underneath her eyes, terrified, silenced in shock. It never even occurred to her to shout out for help to her sleeping brothers who were in the same room. She just sat there, shivering. Only a minute left to midnight when a whispered voice rent the still air. A voice that she could only assume was coming from this shadow. It said to her, "Don't go." Suddenly midnight struck, and the figure turned into a floating mass of smoky shadow and began to circle faster and faster around her bed. It said the same thing over and over again. Don't go, it's not safe. As it continued to race around her bed in an endless loop, Mom pulled the cover over her head like any of us used to do when we were scared as a child. She stayed there until eventually it stopped. She didn't move all night. She never left to go and meet the owner. The rising sun inevitably shone through the window, giving my mom the courage to unveil herself from the duvet. She hadn't slept the entire night, but she knew she wasn't crazy. With the comfort that the morning had finally arrived, and hearing her brothers quietly snoring, she shot out of bed and ran to her father's bedroom to wake him. She told him everything, from the way the owner had been talking to her and her brothers, to the owner asking her to meet him late at night, even the shadowy figure that stopped her from leaving the room. She didn't care that she sounded silly. All she knew was that she was terrified and that she needed her dad. Luckily, her dad didn't need any more convincing than that. He believed her. That was the kind of dad he was. He had no shadow of a doubt, pun intended, that she was telling the truth. He quietly took her back to her bedroom, where her brothers were now awake. He mentioned nothing of the shadowy figure. Her dad asked her brothers about the owner's behavior, and they confirmed everything my mom had said. That morning, the dad didn't leave their side, as he helped them pack up their belongings and dash out of there, not even saying goodbye. Once home, my mom's dad called the police to tell them what had happened, excluding the supernatural part, of course. They insisted they check this guy out for the safety of his family. An arrest was made. The police already knew who this was. Turns out the owner of that cabin, the guy who pretended to be friends with my mom's dad, had already been convicted of horrific acts against children. In fact, he was even a murderer who had been on the run for years. His name and photo was in the newspaper the following week. The police told my grandfather that my mom was very smart for choosing not to go and meet the man on that bridge. As my mom grew older, she told me that she thought more and more about that holiday. How if that shadowy figure had not appeared in her room that night, scaring her to stay in her bed. She may have never left the Australian outback alive. I'm 19 years old, living in a small farming town in Michigan. This story happened when I was 17. I was camping at my buddy's house. I brought my dog over to try to help with his raccoon problem. Let's call my buddy A. My dog was a yellow lab, while A had a Rottweiler mix. When I arrived at his house around 6 p.m., we greeted each other, then went into the house and upstairs to play some video games for a couple of hours. During this time, both our dogs often stared out the bedroom window, looking directly at one spot in the surrounding woods by the house. We blew it off as maybe them seeing a deer or a coyote. Eventually, A suggested we start setting up camp. I agreed, so we grabbed our things from his bedroom and headed downstairs. As we headed down, A grabbed his pellet gun, which is propped up against a wall. When we got downstairs, his dad was in the living room, watching TV. He asked what we were doing. A told him we were going to camp out, about half a mile away from the house. He gave us the thumbs up, reminding us not to do anything stupid out there. "We won't," I replied. We made our way out the door and loaded our gear onto the back of his dad's four-wheeler. We sped off, riding along a thin trail between the cornfields and the woods. The sun was sinking at this point, just an orange glow peeking over the top of the cornfield. "We better get this tent set up before it gets completely dark out, or else the demons might get us," I remember joking. "Ah, shut up," A laughed. When we arrived, we parked and grabbed our things, venturing into the woods. A while after that, we had the tent set up, with all our stuff inside. We even had a fire going. My dog was lying by the fire chewing on a stick. A's dog had went off into the woods somewhere. We hung around the fire for a while, drinking Mountain Dew and cracking jokes. A suddenly jumped up from his chair. "Ah, crap," he exclaimed. "What's wrong?" I asked. "I forget a bunch of stuff back at the house." I volunteered to stay back and keep an eye on the fire while he went to get it. He said okay and headed off. So there I was, completely alone with the dogs in the dark woods. It was a cloudy night that night, so the only light provided was from the small campfire. About 5 minutes later, I began wondering what was taking him so long. It was so quiet. Too quiet. I didn't hear any crickets or coyotes, not even the sound of a breeze. This bothered me, and soon I felt on edge. Suddenly, both dogs growled viciously at something in the woods. I get up and began to scan the forest, trying to spot anything I could. There I saw it, 15 feet away from me or so. There was something tall, standing in the tree line. I thought it was a person at first. They appeared to be 7 feet tall, with dark skin, bony fingers. Then I noticed they had mangy, stringy hair all over them. This was no man. Its eyes were the most terrifying part. They were like ice white and glowed, or perhaps reflected what little light there was. Those eyes seemed to pierce my soul. The dogs were barking at it now. It turned its attention to them, releasing an ear-shattering, scream-like hiss. The dogs both tucked their tails between their legs and began to cower. The creature looked back at me. "Help me, God," I breathed. When I said this, I swear, that thing made a sound like it was laughing. I began to sweat, my heart beating out of my chest. I looked down then, realizing A had left his pellet gun behind. I wanted to grab it, but I felt paralyzed. I looked back up at this thing. It took a step towards me. That was enough to make me snap out of it. In one swift motion, I dove towards the ground, picking up the gun. In a split second, I aimed and fired. I popped the thing right between its eyes, but it didn't seem to care. It laughed again, in the most god-awful way. Then, still watching me, it slank back into the shadows. I felt dizzy, as if I was going to pass out, and when A got back, I insisted we slept in the house.
New Zealand is an incredibly beautiful place, especially if you're interested in outdoor activities, such as camping or hiking. And while I don't enjoy living there, I love the scenery and natural beauty of these islands. You see, I'm Australian, but I've spent most of my life in New Zealand. The wildlife is incredibly tame compared to Australia. There's nothing here at all that's really dangerous. A brief history. Prior to the arrival of the Maori some 600 to 800 years ago, the islands were dominated by birds, plants, and insects, with the only mammals being 2 species of bats. The ghosts of Gondwana, as they say, due to the millions of years of isolation. The Maori brought with them pigs, rats, and dogs. The Europeans brought the rest of the mammals found here, and they introduced a heck of a lot of plants and birds too. So, overall, the risk of attacks by any type of animal while camping is essentially zero. The largest mammalian predators are dogs, cats, weasels, and stoats. And in the 34 years I've lived here, I've never seen a weasel nor a stoat in the wild, let alone a feral dog. Cats, sure, sometimes, but still not often. Even though I really don't like living here, I do often recommend that people I know who have never been here come to visit at least once, solely for the immense natural beauty. One person who took me up on this offer was a cousin of mine from Australia. We'd only met when we were babies and toddlers. I have a vague memory of meeting her when I lived in Sydney. Must have been around the age of 3. She's a year younger than me, so she doesn't remember that. We connected on social media a long time ago, and we hit it off. She's cool, so when she told me she wanted to come and visit here in New Zealand, I was excited. I planned a road trip around the South Island, which is where I live. Christchurch, to be specific. Personally, I believe the South Island is the best island in this archipelago. We were going to have an amazing time, I thought. After her arrival, we spent a night at my house, then set off south, with the first stop being scheduled to be Mount Cook, or Aoraki, in the Gai Tahu dialect of Maori. However, upon arrival, we found it raining, and I wasn't really in the mood to set up 2 tents for us to sleep in the rain. We decided to go farther south, and luckily we found a place that we could set up our tents at, for free. And there it wasn't raining. By the time we found this place, it was getting dark. It was near a river, and was heavily forested. But with it being New Zealand, the land wasn't supposed to have any dangerous wildlife. So this didn't bother me in the slightest. During the process of setting up the tents, I found that the one I brought for me to use was missing parts, essential for it to be set up. This meant I'd have to share with my cousin. No big deal. We're family, even if it was initially awkward because I'm a man and she's a woman. We got a fire going. We cooked some food and ate. Spent some amazing time under the clear skies talking about pretty much everything we could think of. Finally, we were tired enough to sleep, so we got in the tent and talked a bit more before drifting off. At some stage during the night, I woke up to a horrible sound. I quickly sat up and checked on my cousin. The darkness of the night made everything seem black and white, but I saw this black liquid bubbling out of her throat as she gagged and gurgled, moving her head slowly side to side. Blood was everywhere, popping out of a massive gash in her throat. She was simultaneously choking to death and bleeding to death. I didn't know what was going on, but I began to panic. I was in shock that something or someone had torn her throat open. The next thing I remember was waking up. For real this time. I realized it was just a dream, but it felt so real, so vivid. I was incredibly perturbed by this, but eventually I managed to go to sleep again. The next morning I told her about it and how vivid it was, how real it felt, how terrified I'd been that something had tore her throat open, and that she was choking and sputtering on her own blood as it pumped out of her throat and pooled around her head. We both thought it was surreal, but just a dream. Nothing to worry about. Until I opened the tent door. When we got out of the tent, right outside the tent door was the carcass of a rabbit, its throat violently torn open, but not eaten. It was like something had made it a mess on purpose and left it there deliberately as a warning. This had not been there the night before. It wasn't there when we went to sleep. As I've stressed, New Zealand is supposed to be safe. There's nothing here that could pose that kind of danger to us. I mean, there should be nothing that would rip the throat out of a rabbit without at least nibbling on the carcass. And to leave it outside the tent like that, as if for us to see, that's just bizarre. I've never experienced anything like that, and I don't even know what it could have been. Perhaps there's something here that humans don't know about. Whatever it was enough to send chills through me that persist to this day, many years later. This happened a few months ago, at the time of writing this, when my buddy and I went camping at Big Hill Pond in Tennessee. The two of us hadn't hung out in forever, so we decided to go on a camping/fishing trip for the weekend. I woke up Thursday morning, packing my backpack along with some drinks, kissed my wife goodbye, and loaded up all my stuff in my buddy's truck. We headed out, the whole time joking about some ghost stories, some supposed paranormal occurrences we've experienced, comparing them to see whose was scariest. When we got to the campsite, we were the only ones on that side of the park. We set up our tent and we went fishing. We stayed out fishing until around 7:30 to 8 p.m. We then headed back to the campsite, joking and laughing about something or other. When we made it back, we cleaned the bass we'd caught and started getting ready to cook them. Suddenly, a man walked by. He asked what we had to eat. I told him we were fixing up some bass. I asked him if he wanted to sit and drink and eat with us. The man looked tired, as if he'd been running, which isn't unusual. It is a campsite that has a trail for jogging. He agreed. We ate and drank, and before long he stood up, thanked us, and said he was going to get back on the trail, that he appreciated the hospitality, saying you don't find much of that anymore. My buddy, trying to be funny, said, "Don't let a Wendigo get you, bro." The man turned to him, wide-eyed, and replied in a harsh, loud tone, "You should never say that name. Never joke about that thing." He proceeded to power walk away. I looked at my friend and died laughing at him. We began to clean up around 10:30 p.m. I got into my tent after that, and my buddy said he was going to stay up a bit longer. I fell asleep almost right away. The sound of the woods was so calming. At some point in the night, I woke up to the sound of shuffling around my tent. At first, I was startled, but then I remembered my buddy said he was going to be awake still. He was probably just trying to scare me. I smacked the side of the tent and yelled at him, "Dude, knock it off before I use you for bait tomorrow." It stopped immediately after that, and I chuckled, rolling back over. I then said, guess you're scared of me, huh?" I then heard the shuffling sound begin again, going back towards the woods, right behind the tent. I opened my eyes, and I almost broke my neck trying to sit up so fast. Because right when I opened my eyes, right in front of me, someone was pressing their face against the tent wall. After thinking about it, I sarcastically said, Real funny, dude. The face pulled away. After that, I didn't hear anything again. The next morning, I told my buddy, "Since you want to try and scare me, you can cook breakfast today." He replied, "What are you talking about?" "I know it was you shuffling around my tent, pressing your face into it, trying to freak me out." My friend looked at me wide-eyed and said, "Bro, I ended up going to sleep right after you did." I was shaken then. I went looking around my tent. There were bare footprints all around it. I looked at him, and we both decided we were leaving before whoever did this got brave. Who knows what they might do if they came back the next night. As we were leaving, the man from the night before was standing in the woods across from the tents. He was smiling and waving at us. My buddy and I looked at each other and got out of there fast. This may not be the supernatural story you're used to, but sometimes people can be scarier than anything paranormal.
I've always been a big fan of cryptids and the paranormal, although I don't believe in a lot of the encounters I've heard. The idea of the unknown makes me incredibly curious, but they say curiosity killed the cat, and it may have almost killed me. I live in New Mexico. New Mexico has the reputation of being mostly desert, but it still has its beautiful green areas. I love finding and hiking on nature trails, whether it's in the desert or forested hills. On the day of this encounter, I was on a weekend trip hiking some trails in Glorieta, New Mexico. I discovered some cold trails southwest of this large camp complex. I brought my camper, and I'd be staying the night there. I love hiking, but I'm far too paranoid to camp outside at night. That fear has only doubled thanks to this encounter. It was May of 2022. I was on my second day of hiking, the day before I would reach an intersection on the hiking trail. I'd gone left before that. It had taken me through rolling hills, trees, and some small meadows. It was a relatively tame path, and the scenery was gorgeous, but rather claustrophobic. The woods up there in Glorieta have a decent amount of undergrowth, and the trees are mostly slim, growing close to one another. That day, I felt like getting a better view of the area. I decided to go right at the intersection. The path curled up and to the right up the large mountain on the side. This trail was much more rugged, with several parts dissolving as I crossed large boulders, some blocked by a pond from the recent storm that had passed through. I was on this trail for several hours until I reached what seemed to be the top. As I approached, the whistling and howling of wind through the trees and over the mountain got louder and louder. Its eerie moaning put me on edge. I reached the top, and the view was gorgeous. I could see the sprawling Glorieta Valley and beautiful forest for miles in each direction. I could see the camp far below, too. I decided to rest there, to enjoy the view before heading back down. After that short break, I began my descent. I was about halfway down when I detected movement at my peripheral on one of these switchbacks further down the trail. I stopped then, focused. I was wary of the idea of it possibly being a mountain lion. As it turned out, though, it seemed to just be a deer. I relaxed. I was about to continue my journey when I heard a monstrous crackling noise coming from the direction of the deer. I glanced over in time to see something massive fall from a thick tree onto the deer. My curiosity was piqued, just as much as my adrenaline. This creature was the most bizarre thing I'd ever seen in my life. It was massive. From what I could tell, it was about the size of a moose. Its shoulders looked to be at least 8 feet off the ground. Its skin looked identical to the light brown tree bark of the trees in the area. Its body structure reminded me heavily of the Mutos, those massive bug creatures from Godzilla 2014. It had these huge appendages splayed out in front of it. Its body was at an angle. Its rear rested on two smaller, bulkier appendages. Its forearms were the most prominent feature. They were held out in front of it like a praying mantis, except they were touching the ground while extending up to its head. They seemed to have 3 joints with curled tips at the end. They were broad, I'd estimate around 1.5 feet wide. Their ends were withdrawing from the crushed carcass of the deer, which was now twitching on the ground. Its back legs were like a mountain lion's. Each had 4 long digits with bird-like claws. These digits and claws all closely matched the width of its leg. Its face was the most horrendous part about it. It looked like a bat with a short, thick snout and small eyes. It had long, spiky things which looked like ears jutting off the back of its skull. I looked on, frozen, in shock. This thing had blended in so well that I hadn't seen it until it presumably dropped from out of a tree and on to that deer. Had it been up there when I first walked up this mountain? The deer was dead on the trail, this monster standing over it. If it had been there when I walked up, I passed right under it, never realizing it. I could have ran, I could have hid, but a morbid fascination in me wanted to see what was going to happen next. As it was, I figured my best chance of survival was staying completely still, as movement might draw attention to me. I waited and watched. The creature turned back towards a nearby thick tree. I assumed it had dropped out of that one, which was very close to the path. It used one of its bird-like claws on its hind legs, grabbing and holding the deer as it dragged it up, wrapping its massive front appendages around the tree to climb. The joints seemed to curl and lock around the tree, slowly pulling it up the trunk. This reminded me more of a sloth. You know, how they grab around branches with their rounded claws, pulling themselves up, one arm at a time. That's exactly what this thing seemed to be doing, but its entire front appendages were gripping the tree trunk. After about 30 seconds or so, the creature had reached the first major branch, which was far up the massive tree. If I had to guess, I would say it was around 3 stories up at least. It then wrapped those huge front appendages around the branch and hung right side up. It brought the deer up to its mouth, curling its whole torso and holding it steady with its claws. I couldn't help but wonder how strong its abdomen was to do that. I just stared at it, not sure what to do. I probably stood there for about 10 minutes, frozen and watching this thing slowly devour its meal. To my surprise, it also ate the bones of the poor deer. By the time it was done, there was really nothing left of it. It repositioned its front appendages around the branch, once again reminding me of a sloth, rather than a hanging monkey or something. It used its digits on its 2 hind legs to interlock with one another. It then gripped the tree very hard with its whole body, flattening itself against the branch. Its skin camouflaged extremely well. Even though I knew it was there, it was difficult to pick out the outline. Its head seemed to be tucked against the bottom of the tree branch, watching and waiting, just like me. I contemplated if it was maybe sleeping after its meal, but I didn't want to take the risk of walking the path under it. So I waited about 15 minutes before coming up with an idea. I would slowly, inch by inch, lower myself to the ground before retreating up the trail. Once I got to the top, I would go straight through the undergrowth and wilderness towards the camp that I could see in the distance. The lot where my trailer was parked was about a half-mile walk from the camp. I would much rather take my chances through wilderness than follow the trail towards that monster I'd just seen. I carried out my plan. As slowly as possible, I lowered myself to the ground. I then slowly half-crawled, half-pulled myself backwards up the hill, doing my best to limit any sudden or jerky movements. After moving up the hill this way, for what felt like an hour, I was confident I could no longer see the tree that thing was in. I slowly got up, glanced around, and began jogging back up the trail. I'd spent most of my life as an avid jogger and hiker, and I ran in high school and college, so I like to think I have a lot of endurance. I jogged back up to the top of the mountain before picking my way slowly down towards the camp. This mountain wasn't like the image that comes to your head when you think of a mountain. It didn't have a steep slope to a sharp point, but rather a steep slope that rounded off onto a flat and large top. It was still around 1,000 feet higher than the camp. At first, the going was pretty easy. It didn't become more treacherous until the end, but I made it safely down. By the time I made it back to my camper, it was around 6 in the afternoon. I was still freaked out, and I decided to call my weekend there. I drove right back home, and I haven't been back to those trails since. I have no idea what that creature was, but it certainly fascinates me. I feel an urge to go back up there again, maybe to see if I can find it, take some pictures. If I do go, I don't think I'll go alone. From this point on, I've always carried a concealed firearm for self-defense. Be careful when you're hiking in forests. You've heard a lot about the forest going quiet, about strange creatures calling to you in the voices of your loved ones, of far-off, unnatural howls. But at least, in those scary situations, you're given a warning. You've got time to react. But when you hear the breaking branches of something massive above you, the whooshing sound of air followed by the crushing of your body under the weight of a monster, there is no time to react. You'll be dead. Stay safe out there, and happy hiking. This story happened about 3 years ago. I was 23, and I was with my two best friends, Mike and Logan. We decided to go camping at this place called Cunningham State Park. I'm from Maryland, and Cunningham was the go-to camping place for me and my family since I was little. I'd always heard stories about the Maryland Goat Man, but I never believed them. We decided it was going to be a 4-day camping trip. We arrived on a Thursday afternoon and set up camp. We each had our own tent. Mike had a small 2-person tent, while Logan and I both had our 5-person tents. Now, where we were was not at the regular campsites. It was kind of a forbidden place in the middle of the park. On the first night, nothing happened. On the second day, we went into the town nearby, spending the entire day there. We came back to the campsite at around 6 p.m. We made a fire then, and at one point Josh said he was going to go take a leak. He went off, but about 30 seconds later, he came running back into the campsite, screaming. "What the heck happened, dude?" Mike asked, confused. "There's something out there," Josh replied. "Wussy," I said. "Probably just a deer or a black bear." He went back to his tent. Mike and I stayed up a little later, but eventually we went to sleep. In the middle of the night, I think around 3 a.m., I heard something moving around outside my tent, but I ignored it and tried to go back to sleep. I woke up at 7 a.m. after that. I made some breakfast. My camping buddies and I went hiking for the entire day. Most of the hike, I felt like something was watching me, but I just brushed it off. We made it back to camp at 4 p.m. We sat around the campfire for a while. At around 10 p.m., we all crawled into our tents. At about 2 a.m., I heard Mike from the other tent unzip his tent. "What the heck?" I heard him say. I then heard a loud screech coming from the woods. I grabbed my handgun, loaded it, and walked outside. "What was that?" I was about to say, when I saw something moving in the trees. I heard the screech again. This time Josh came from his tent. "Grab your shotgun," I told him. He did, no questions asked. When he came back, something jumped out of the woods. It was holding an axe. Whatever it was especially hairy too. It didn't look like a man. Something was wrong with its legs. Mike and I fired in a panic, and without reloading, we ran back to the truck. We made it back and sped off. I turned around at one point and saw it standing there. I say it because I don't think it was a man. We immediately called the police. They went back there, found all our stuff thrashed and destroyed. There was no body, but there was some blood. The cops said they did hear screaming, though. It's been about 3 years since this, and I still have nightmares about it. I've been around many animals in my time, both wild and domesticated. I've not seen anything by this description. I've seen tigers at zoos. I've been around wild boars, sows, tree-dwelling animals, possums, flying foxes, anything else with teeth and claws. However, what I saw that weekend was a nightmare. I was a curious young lady, being in my early 30s and still limber after having 2 children. I was still a big kid at heart. I was camping at the time, trying to sleep. Out there you hear a lot of wildlife. Bugs, owls, lizards that make those loud clicking noises that make you want to put a pillow over your face. Dingoes howling in the distance. I was trying my best to doze off, listening to all these sounds, when, all at once, instantly, they all suddenly stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. Before I could even be unnerved by the sudden silence, I started to hear something tearing at the outer layer of my tent, like a Stanley knife cutting through tarp. I armed myself with my hunting knife, mace, and dolphin torch. I waited until the noises stopped, and I waited even longer. Eventually, I exited the tent to see if I could find what had been making the noise. There was blood everywhere. From what, I don't know. I hadn't been hunting that night. I felt sick to my stomach, like I was going to puke at any moment. I turned from side to side, trying to find the source of the blood, wondering if what caused it might still be there. I listened to this rustling in the trees behind me. I was so scared at the moment, thinking something might pounce on me. Then it happened. Something fell from the tree and landed on me. Whatever it was clawed at me, slashed and bit. I swung my knife wildly at it before it suddenly let go. I heard a loud thud, followed by rapid, scurrying footsteps. I tried to look at it, but it crawled away so quickly in the dark that I only got a brief glance. And what I saw made me feel even more sick. It had ears like a red fox, eyes completely red, with seemingly no pupils or iris. In fractions of a second, it disappeared within the trees, leaving me in silence. As I mentioned at the start, I'd seen plenty of animals in my life, but I've never seen anything like this. I ran back to my ute with all my adrenaline pumping, and I drove away as quickly as I could.